With President Trump winning the election, it is leading many people to wonder, what will the result be on the economy? We already have asset prices like Bitcoin reaching all-time highs and the S&P 500 reaching new all-time highs, but those are just initial reactions from public markets. What will the impact of the policies that he tries to put in place be for the economy overall and the average person's wallet? Over the next coming months, we will certainly get more details on Trump's plan for the economy and on Congress's willingness to push any of it through. But we can classify everything Trump plans to do into 4 buckets. We have tax cuts, tax increases, spending cuts, and regulation, or I should say deregulation. So let's start with tax cuts, because this is going to potentially be the most impactful for most people. The tax cuts that Trump is talking about range from eliminating taxes on overtime, eliminating taxes on tips. He's even floated the idea out there of completely eliminating the income tax. We've seen him advance talk about various tax credits, like increasing the child tax credit to something like $5,000 per child. Even though that'd be called a tax credit, it is still a tax cut. Trump has talked about reducing taxes or eliminating taxes on the interest on auto loans. Trump and Congress have both talked about bringing back bonus depreciation up to 100% where it was at the beginning of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And there are potentially more examples. But across the board, most of the economic ideas being talked about are tax cuts in one form or another. During fiscal year 2023, the US government took $4.9 trillion from American households and businesses in the form of various taxes. The vast majority of that was individual income taxes, but we also saw a massive chunk of that for Social Security and Medicare taxes. Corporate income tax would be the 3rd largest bracket, and then various smaller buckets after that. We can take a look at this chart, which plots the total amount the federal government takes in taxes every single year. And we can see that outside of a few dips, this chart usually only goes up and to the right, which means every year the government takes more and more in taxes. All else being equal, tax cuts are usually beneficial to both households and businesses because it means more money is left in the hands of productive people. Any money that is taken away from individuals, households, businesses, and transferred to the government is going to be spent on things that are by definition non-productive, meaning it is a drain on wealth. Any of that money left in the hands of businesses and individuals means that people get to spend that money the way that they want, whether that is on consumption or investment. The consumption, though, still drives economic activity. So all else being equal, more money left in the hands of people means a better economy and people are better off, more wealthy, richer. At this point, it is unclear how many of the proposed tax cuts are actually going to come to fruition, and almost certainly entirely eliminating the individual income tax is not going to happen at all. But things like getting rid of taxes on tips, getting rid of taxes on overtime, these are all ways to let Americans keep more of the money that belongs to them, that they earn, so that they can do with it what they want. Now, the second bucket you might be surprised to hear is tax increases. And this is commonly called tariffs, but in reality, it is a tax increase. A tariff is a tax that the government places on a specific type of good, and that is one that comes from another country. Now, Trump has been more specific to talk about, hey, we're going to have certain percentage tariffs on things that come from China. We're going to have larger percentage tariffs on things that are manufactured in Mexico. And he wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. So he's going to artificially disincentivize Americans from buying things made in places outside of the United States by simply making them more expensive. That will create an artificial economic incentive to make those things here instead, and people to buy those things from here instead because it is cheaper than getting them from somewhere else because you have to pay a larger tax bill to do so. It is almost certain that any tariffs that do get passed that are larger than they are right now will be nowhere near the amount of tax cuts that will be given from things like credits, removing taxes on tips or anything like that, which means that the tax increases and the tax cuts that Trump is proposing will almost certainly net out to be less income for the government rather than an equal amount of income for the government. So with 2023 seeing $4.9 trillion in total taxes taken from Americans, so 2024 seeing $4.9 trillion taken away from Americans, it is likely that we see this number go down for 2025. The one caveat to that is that Tax rates and tax revenues are not necessarily directionally correlated. What do I mean by that? Well, if the government was to institute, let's say, a 100% tax on everything, yeah, their taxes might go up in year 1, but then their taxes would go to 0 in year 2 because they would have already taken everything there. There's nothing left in the productive sector for production, therefore there's nothing left to tax on. So if you increase the tax rate enough, well, you decrease economic activity to a point where the total amount of tax dollars the government gets actually goes down. On the other hand, sometimes when you decrease tax rates, it allows so much more money to be used by the productive economy that the economy grows so much that even though the tax percentage is lower, the total amount of dollars the government gets to take actually grows. So sometimes even if you lower the tax rates on the economy overall, the government will still wind up with more tax revenue in total. So it is possible that this situation does happen where enough tax decreases are placed in the right areas and enough economic increases happen overall that the government actually takes more money in taxes even though the percentage is smaller. Next up, we have the third bucket of economic changes that could take place under Trump, and that is deregulation. Now, there are hundreds of government agencies, and for those who are not aware, the way the framers of the Constitution set up our country was supposed to be a separation of powers. We have one part of the government that's there to create the laws. That's the legislative branch. And in the Constitution, it says that is Congress and Congress alone, the House of Representatives and the Senate. They're the only guys that can write the laws. You also need somebody who carries out the laws, who enforces the laws. We want those guys to be different than the guys making the laws. You don't want the police officers to be walking up and down the streets and have the power to make up the law as they go. They're there to enforce the law, but they can't decide what that law is. Otherwise, that's too much power and too much potential for abuse. So the people who make the laws are different than the people who enforce the laws. So that's the second branch, is the executive branch. That's everything under the president. You have a third branch that's there to interpret the law. That's the judicial branch, that's the courts, that's the judges. Because when somebody goes to enforce the law and there's a dispute, police officer says, hey, you broke the law. You say, no, I didn't. I was following the law. You need somebody else to interpret and say, who was right? You also don't want that to be the executive branch. You don't want the police officers to be able to just say, well, no, I'm the one who gets to interpret the law, and so I interpret it as if I'm right and you're wrong. No, that's again, too much abuse for power. So all those three powers are separated into separate people. That's the way the country was designed. But over the last couple of decades, we've seen that power from the judicial branch interpreting the law and the legislative branch creating the law concentrated underneath the executive branch through federal agencies. Federal agencies today write rules. They don't write laws, but they have the force of law behind them because the agencies are the ones that are tasked with carrying out the law, with enforcing it. And so since they're the ones who write the rules, they're also enforcing the rules that they write. Now, currently, the way that the federal government operates is the agencies are allowed to write whatever rules they want as long as they don't contradict any law that Congress has already written. Slowly, that is starting to change, and the power of those federal agencies is starting to be reined in, but they are still pretty out of control. The other thing that's crazy is over the last couple of decades, federal agencies have also had the power to interpret the law, because whenever there was a disagreement that went up into higher court cases, the courts would defer to the agencies because the agencies were the experts. And the agencies would obviously say, no, we're right, we interpreted the law correctly. And the court would have to defer to their expertise. And so over the last few decades, federal agencies have been judge, jury, and executioner. They've been the writers of the law, the interpreters of the law, and the enforcers of the law, which meant their power was basically unchecked. Not only that, these people are unelected. They are appointed. They are bureaucrats. They have no accountability to people like us who get to vote people in and out of office. They are placed there with unchecked power, unlimited budgets, getting to make whatever rules they want, enforcing them, and making sure that they keep their power. It is possible that over the next 4 years, that gets completely dismantled and demolished. Underneath RFK Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, it is possible that Trump's team here goes into the federal agencies, eliminates a lot of agencies, cuts some of them down, and allows the public to be able to see the data, see the information, allows the courts and people to start suing in order to rein in some of this unchecked power that was never supposed to be there in the first place. This will have an unprecedented level of freedom increase on people and individuals and businesses businesses allowed to go about their lives and do things the way that they want to do, as long as they're not infringing on other people's rights, and be able to engage in business with each other without having to check with 18 different federal agencies to make sure they're not breaking one of their contradicting rules that aren't even law. If this happens, which I'm not super optimistic that we're gonna see a massive change here, but if we do, this will be the effect of removing a giant tumor from a sick person. All of those resources that the body was sending, all the blood and the oxygen and the water and the food, in order to keep that tumor, the tissue of that tumor, alive on the person, a surgeon goes in there and lops that big tumor off. Suddenly, the body has a lot of resources available to do for its main functions now. It doesn't have to keep that tumor alive. That would essentially be the function. What would happen here if somebody goes in and gets rid of a lot of these agencies? Number one, we save a lot of money. Number two, it allows people and resources in America to just go to what they would go to otherwise, and we'd probably have a pretty big economic boom as a result. Over the coming 6 months to a year, we'll see how likely any of that really is. I'm not holding out hopes for it because we can always find ways to make money regardless, but if it does actually happen that way, I, for one, will be pretty pleased. But now let's take a look at the very last thing, which is the net effect of all of this for the government's finances, because we all know the government's financial situation is pretty bad. Yes, they've collected $4.9 trillion in taxes from us involuntarily just this year alone, but over the same exact period, they spent $6.7 trillion. This is a chart of their spending. You can see right now it says 6.3 trillion, so it's just not completely up to date here to show 2024, but you can see this chart only goes up. Regardless of the fact that they take more money in taxes every year, they always spend way more than that. During 2024, the difference between what they took in taxes and what they spent was $1.8 trillion, which means this is what that deficit looks like over time. Every single year, the trend is that the difference between the money the government takes in taxes and the money they spend gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And every time this happens, they have to borrow to make up the difference, which is why the national debt is at $36 trillion. It's also why interest on the debt is now 13% of all of the money the US government has to spend every year. It's more than Medicare, it's more than national defense, and every other category outside of health and social security, which means just to make sure they don't default on the debt and continue making payments on the debt, that is the third largest expense for the government. And because it's debt getting paid with debt, that number goes up every year, which means left alone, soon the interest on the debt becomes the largest expense for the government. It is simply unsustainable, and it is only going to be dealt with through printing. So what is the effect of all of these proposed Trump policies on the government's financial situation? Well, we already know that he wants to push through a bunch of tax cuts, which at best will be revenue neutral, which means that yes, they cut the tax rates, but economic activity picks up enough to where they're able to increase the total dollars they take. So they get the same number of dollars they take in taxes, even though it's a smaller percentage. Very rarely does the tax revenue total actually go up from a tax cut. It's possible, but it's not going to be huge. In all likelihood, the tax revenue total will probably go down. So by itself, the tax cuts will mean a bigger deficit for the US government. That's why the yield on US government debt right now, like the 10-year treasury yield, skyrocketed as soon as it became clear Trump was winning the election. Because especially if Trump's second term is anything like his first, deficits are going to get bigger. We can see that's exactly what happened during his first presidency. 2017, 2018, 2019, the deficit got worse and worse every year, and that wasn't even counting all the spending that he did in 2020. But there is one silver lining to this, and that is spending cuts. We know there are no actual proposed spending cuts yet. However, Elon Musk has been pretty vocal about what he wants to help Trump do in terms of cutting government waste. And he says there's up to $2 trillion that he could help Trump cut from federal spending. Now, if you've looked into the way that the federal government spends money in the military, on healthcare, on education, the billions of dollars that they spend on all these crazy little programs that don't actually ever result in anything, they just go to line people's pockets that happen to get those contracts, you know that there's probably way more than $2 trillion of cutting that they can do. I mean, just look at the total numbers of dollars that the government spends every year. If they cut $2 trillion, they'd still be spending at 2019 levels, which was already crazy and already a ton of waste still there. There's a lot more than $2 trillion that could get cut from the spending. But if Trump is able to push through large cuts because of deregulations, clearing out the federal agencies, making everything a lot more efficient, it's possible they knock 1 trillion, 2 trillion off of the total spending. Given the current size of US government spending and current deficits, it is unclear whether that would be enough to actually push us over into a surplus. And the way that I would bet my money is that we'd be nowhere near a surplus. That with the tax cuts and the spending cuts together, we're still going to be running at least $1 trillion deficit every year. However, the silver lining around that is that the tumor is going to be partially removed from the American economy, which means even though the government is still going to be racking up more debt, it'll be increasing at a slower pace than it's increasing right now. In other words, it's like you're in a car going 60 miles an hour, you slow down to 50 or 40 miles an hour. It's like, yeah, you're still moving forward, but at least you're slowing down. The second thing is that all the spending cuts and the tax cuts together should allow a lot more resources and freedom for the economy to be a lot more productive and to produce more wealth. And I don't have time here, I'm gonna have to make another video about this, but there are a ton of people saying that if a bunch of tax cuts and especially spending cuts and a big cut in government employees goes through, there'll be a big recession or depression. That is the farthest thing from the truth. Even if you fired 90% of all federal government employees, every single bit of shrinking you do for the size of the federal government is more wealth for the economy, more wealth for individuals. It's the opposite of a recessionary force. Think about it like this, and I'll end with this. Right now, you make, let's say, $100,000 a year, gross. You look at your paycheck, your stub, you see the federal income tax, the state income tax, the Social Security, the Medicare, everything comes out. By the end of it all, you're left with $60,000 a year. What would you do with an extra $20,000 a year, $30,000 a year, $40,000 a year left in your pocket? Keep in mind, your company that is employing you also has to pay taxes just to have you as an employee. So you're getting 100, but they have to pay 150 or more just to have you as an employee. What if those taxes are shrunk? How much more of that money could you keep in your pocket? Would you be better off or worse off? Would the people around you be better off or worse off? Would you be able to spend more money on the businesses and the things you care about, or would you be able to spend less money? Would you be able to invest and save better for the future and be more independent and less reliant on people? Or would you be more destitute and more reliant on the government to bail you out? You would be much better off, and so would everybody. This would lead to economic booms. This would lead to growth. This would lead to progress, not depression, not recession, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.